Everyone, and welcome to another edition of Mormon Stories Podcast. I'm your host, John DeLynn. It's December 14th, 2017. We're broadcasting to you live from Holiday, Utah, in my home. And I could not be more excited for today's interview. I actually think this might be the interview of the year, maybe of the half decade. I'm so super excited about this interview. Today we're interviewing Tom Christofferson, and we're interviewing him about this new book that he's recently come out with by Desert Book called That We May Be One, a gay Mormon's perspective on faith and family. And this interview is super important for so many reasons. Personally, my life has been touched by the LGBT Mormon experience in very personal, direct ways through my family and through friends. Many of you will know I did my PhD dissertation on the LGBT Mormon experience. I published 9 or 10 academic journal articles on the topic, and it's something that I care passionately about. But of course, the LGBT Mormon experience is something that has been very, very prominent in the LDS Church over the past 10 or 15 years. And it really, just like kind of polygamy kind of defined Mormonism up through the 1890s or, turn of the century, 1900s. And then the blacks and the priesthood issue so much defined Mormonism in the 50s, let's just say 60s and 70s. The LGBT Mormon experience sort of really defines Mormonism in 2017 and let's just say over the past 10 years. But more importantly, and I have to admit, this book, has generated some controversy. Generally, I think it's been very well received, but it's also generated controversy, especially with a lot of my listeners. And I went into this, reading this book very cautious, probably a little bit skeptical. You're laughing. Because, these are very sensitive topics that affect a lot of people. And, in my opinion, lives are at stake. But I'm going to tell you 4 reasons why I think this book is really important. Number one, there are very few people who I've followed within sort of the Mormon circles that carries the reputation that Tom Christofferson does in terms of his character, the way he comports himself, just the way he behaves, and his reputation. So I'm honored to have him on Mormon Stories just as a model for thoughtfulness, for faith, for integrity, etc. That's number one. Number 2 is I have read this book, and I believe that this book is created as a guide for believing LGBT Mormons, but also for their family, for their friends, for church members, and for even church leadership. It's a very important work, and I believe that it will overall have a very positive effect on the church, on its culture, and even on the church itself. So that's why it's important. Specifically around how it might help the family of LGBT Mormons treat their LGBT youth and young adults differently. If any of you are familiar with Caitlin Ryan's work, The Family Acceptance Project, she's written that a highly rejected LGBT youth is 3 times more likely to engage in risky sexual behavior, 3 times more likely to engage in risky drug use, and 8 times more likely to attempt suicide if they are highly rejected by family and friends. And if I were to guess maybe what the primary motive of this book is, and Tom can tell me if I'm wrong as we interview, it's to help believing family and friends of LGBT Mormons not reject their LGBT youth and make a place for them, not only in the families, but also in the ward and the church experience. And if it's successful in doing that, it will save lives. And in that sense, I think it's a super important book. Third thing is, I think Tom is trying to offer alternative or, his perspectives on what might be a kinder, gentler, more compassionate, more Christ-like theology for Mormonism. And we can talk a little bit about that, but I think in 2017, we need that. We need to dig deeper and to strive harder to put forward a version of Mormonism that is more healing and more accepting and more tolerant. And I think more inclusive. And I think Tom makes that case in this book, which makes it bigger than just the LGBT Mormon experience, in my view.
I hope so.
And then the final thing is, I think for even disaffected Mormons, this book may have something really important to offer in terms of, and we can talk about this a bit, but he talks about the refiner's fire that is trying to engage with believing family and friends, and even with the church. As an LGBT Mormon, there's a refiner's fire process that puts one through that I think even disaffected or non-believing or post-Mormons can benefit from if they're willing to sort of check out the book. Now, having said all that, that doesn't mean that there won't be some hard questions here.
Here's the butt.
There won't, but I just want to make sure it's explicit from the start that my intent is to sort of showcase the wonderful thing that is you in this book. So, Tom Christofferson, welcome to Mormon Stories Podcast.
Thank you, John. Belatedly, thank you, John.
Tom thinks that this interview will only be 1 hour at the most. I disagree, but
I think we're going to run out of anything.
He's going to tap out. When he's ready, he's going to tap out and say, I'm done. So, welcome.
Thank you.
Is there anything that just at the outset you want to sort of say, let's not go there? So I want to be respectful. Are there any areas where you sort of generally don't like to go?
Well, I always get the question of, what does your brother say when you ask him, ...
Right.
And our conversations are private between us. But thank you for that very generous introduction. The one thing I would say, just as a kind of a starting point for a conversation, is my hope when I was writing the book was that this could be, an element in improving the communication, the conversation that takes place within the church and within families. And it's not, I didn't mean this as here's what everyone should do. It was simply, look, here's been my experience, my family's experience, my experience in a ward, and I hope that might be something that generates ideas or, encourages people to think about what might work best in their individual circumstance. So it's not a how-to book. It's really just here's something for you to consider. If it resonates, wonderful, and if it doesn't, wonderful.
Excellent. Okay. Any other corrections about my long introduction? Do you accept the praise or do you reject it?
Now I'm understanding why it's 2 hours long.
Or longer.
Thanks.
If it's 2, it'll be short. Okay, so I'm just sharing this book. I do want to invite my Mormon Stories listeners who are joining us live to please feel free to share their comments or questions. We've already written down 100+ questions from people, so we're not going to get to all your questions, but we do want to welcome people to share. So with that, let's begin.
All right.
Let's talk about your early experience as a Mormon.
Right.
What the church meant to you as a youth, and then weave in your first understandings of same-sex attraction.
Honestly, I think the first understanding of same-sex attraction might have come sooner than any real understanding of the church, because I remember an experience about age 5 when I sort of understood that I reacted to something differently than my brothers did, and didn't have language to explain what that was, but I knew that there was an element where we were different. And it wasn't until I was probably in junior high that I figured out what that really was. And I think, junior high was also the point where, a very engaged, believing family translated all into the beginning of some personal experiences in my own understanding of the church and my own developing sense of what that would mean in my life.
So you knew from a very early age. Talk just a little bit more about what faith meant in your family. How did your family, in what ways were they Orthodox or devout? And how did they, what type of family, faith-based family did they build?
I think the big experience in our family that was during my lifetime anyway, that really was the solidifying of the connection to the church was that we moved to New Jersey from Utah when I was 3. So I'm the youngest of 5 boys in my family, and Dad was a veterinarian. He'd been, immediately before we left, he'd been the Utah State veterinarian, and then accepted a position with Squibb in New Jersey doing veterinary pharmaceutical research and development. And when we got to New Jersey, we were, being Mormon was a rarity. It wasn't something that most people had ever really encountered or understood. And I think, that brought us closer together as a family, but it brought us very close to other members of the ward. And, our ward was scattered over a large area, and some people were from the West and had no family nearby, so the ward becomes your family, and some were recent converts to the church, and that might have created challenges in their families, so the ward becomes your family. Because I think that was my early experience of the church, was that it was this very tight social network, as well as all the theological aspects of it.
How was your testimony forged early on? Did you have spiritual experiences that sort of affirmed your testimony in the church? And if so, what can you say about them?
I did, and I, probably age-appropriate ones, in the sense of, early experiences were pretty basic. But I started reading the Book of Mormon when I was in junior high, and and with the idea that I really wanted to figure out what it was all about, why that was such a big deal in our family, and had experiences in that regard that were the beginning of my connectivity to the book. And I think it also just, the feeling of answered prayers. That junior high was a really hard time for me, and going to school every day was a nerve-wracking experience.
Were you bullied?
That's the first time anybody ever called me a homo, and I have joked that that's when I figured it out, because I went to the library in the junior high and looked it up and realized indeed I was. But I remember, I wasn't a very sporty kid, so I didn't really fit in that sense. But I'd always had friends in elementary school that wasn't a big deal. We'd get on our bikes and go somewhere. That was kind of what you did at that era. But in junior high, it went from a fairly small elementary school to a huge junior high school. And I didn't really figure out how to relate there.
There's the stereotype that you can sort of tell if someone's gay, right?
Yeah.
And of course that's not true. But as I've met you and talked to you, your traits are not ones that I would go, oh, for sure. When you were a kid, would you say you would have had more stereotypical traits or not? Or
probably so, because I had a real phobia about whether I walked right, or if I used my hands too much or too little, or in the right way, and whether I had a sibilant S. I was
had a what?
Right, whatever. And to me, those were all very gay traits. I needed to be sure that I wasn't doing those things.
So you practiced or worked on not giving any signs.
It was almost, in a sense, and especially junior high was the hardest time. It was almost like living and watching at the same moment, and just being hypercritical of how I was conveying myself or how other people would experience it, which is probably one of the reasons I hated it so much. But,
You hated middle school?
Hated it.
Did high school get better?
Yeah, high school was great, but as I started high school, we moved to a small town in central Utah, Delta, and so it was a completely different experience from anything that I had growing up, in terms of always living in suburbs of major cities, first New York and then Chicago. But to me, it was perfect. It was really, it was a small group, almost exclusively Mormon, and it kind of worked. I found a place to fit in a great group of friends, pardon me, who have been lifelong friends.
There are stereotypes, and even ones that decades ago the church advanced, that homosexuality is a choice, that it's a factor of abuse, that it's a factor of not having the right parenting sort of role models or participants, that it's, all sorts of things. For you, did you think about, what the cause of it was? And then or now, do you have a position on for you if there was like a nature cause versus a nurture cause or a combination?
Right. I mean, two things I'd say there. One is that was certainly in the ether, and I was aware of it. It wasn't a big preoccupation of mine, but when I did come out, it was huge for my parents. It was so hard for them at the beginning because they felt like they had done something wrong that had caused this. And it's just awful. I mean, it's such a pernicious effect of bad science, or bad social science at least, that they would beat themselves up for a period of time. Dad thought he had traveled too much when I was young, and that was the problem. Mom thought she'd been too close to me, and that was the problem. And it's, what a horrible thing to do to people. Anyway, but the other piece of that is that that wasn't something that I spent a lot of time thinking about for myself. To me, it was just kind of, it is what it is. But it was also in that era, especially pre-mission, something that I wanted so desperately to never have to tell anybody. This is my guilty secret, and I didn't ever want to have to talk to anybody about it because I thought it was so evil. And so, my prayers so often were, change me. I'll do this thing. I'll be so good. Just take this away or make me someone else. And I have come to feel, and it's not doctrinal, it's just my own feeling, that essentially that prayer is, pull the spirit out of my body, kill it, and put a new one in. Because I think my way of relating to the world is very wrapped up in kind of the things I think we would consider to be gay. Because to me, it's so much bigger than sex. It's the emotional connection, it's the way I perceive and relate and everything else.
So for you, is it fair to say that you're okay with the idea that being gay or lesbian is part, or maybe predominantly, biological?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay.
I mean, look, I'm no scientist, right? But it makes sense to me that, number one, I'm utterly convinced nobody chose it. And it's not that it's such a horrible thing why would anybody choose it, although there was a time period when it was. But it's more just like, why would you choose to be different if, when you're making supposedly that choice, you have no sense of what any benefit is going to be. And it's just crazy, I think, even to imagine that there's a choice. I don't. Maybe there's some nurture element that's deeply in your early years, but to me, I think it's almost certainly some aspect of nature.
So did you receive or absorb the prevailing church teachings about homosexuality during the time? And if so, did that hurt you, and how?
Sure. And it was, I guess I had faith that somehow it could work out, right? I didn't feel like I'd done anything wrong, but somehow it was there, and so I was sure God could take care of it for me. I remember being in when I was growing up, when I was an early teen, when you lived outside of Utah, General Conference came via audio only. So you'd go to the stake center and you'd hear the audio, and that was already in advance from before we knew anything. You'd get reports from somebody who attended. But I remember sitting in the stake center. I think I was 12 or 13 when Elder Packer gave the talk about the little factory, and dying. Just thinking, oh my gosh. Just because I didn't understand what the heck he was referring to at that point, but somehow it felt to me like it was related to all these other things I was feeling, and was yet another thing I just didn't want to have to talk about anyway.
Did you, there's the Miracle Forgiveness book. Did any of those teachings, Fitzgerald Kindle or whatever, that it's a sin, that it's evil, that it's loathsome, that it's satanic, whatever?
Yeah, you can keep going.
Did that reach you as a teen?
It didn't as a teen. I read it when I was on a mission.
Okay.
And I came away, as so many people did, thinking, if you're ever forgiven, it will be a miracle. It was like, that book was so, I don't know, pessimistic almost. And in a sense of what it takes to be forgiven, which has not been my experience.
And I want you to always feel comfortable. Just say I don't want to talk about that. Very common. The gay men that I've interviewed never even experimented with it prior to their mission. It wasn't even. It was just like
I had crushes.
Okay.
I mean, there were boys in junior high and high school that I was really attracted to, but I never did anything about it. And so when I went on my mission, my whole prayer was like, okay, I'll do the best I can, and then if I'm a really good missionary, you'll take this away from me.
So you did make that prayer, and what was that like? What you referenced it a bit. What was it like for you to try and make it go away? What did it do to you? What was the process like?
Well, for one thing, it consumes a whole lot of energy and focus that could be better spent somewhere else. Right? I mean, in my view, this is not something that's going to change by prayer. In my view, that's because Heavenly Father doesn't feel the need to change it. And so, I mean, teenage years are so hard anyway, but I wasted a whole lot of energy and self-flagellation on, this thing that I couldn't talk to anybody about, but I knew was so horrible somehow.
Did you talk to your bishop about it before your mission, or parents, anyone?
Nope.
So you didn't come out in any way prior to your mission?
I did. My second oldest brother, and I had a conversation one time that I think probably gave him a clue, but it wasn't necessarily, I wasn't crystal clear.
Right.
He just was smart enough to figure it out.
Yeah. So in my research, one of the papers I did was on attempts to change sexual orientation.
Yeah.
And a lot of the focus in the news and in the literature is on using like a psychotherapist to try and change your sexual orientation.
Yeah.
But what we found was the most damaging way of attempting change was to do it through religious means, through prayer, through fasting,
Right.
through hyper-religiosity.
Right.
Does that resonate with you?
Sure.
And if you can explain why is that particularly harmful relative to other ways to try and change?
Well, among other things, I think it's damaging to faith because you think you're trying to do everything you can to be worthy of a blessing or of a prayer being answered. That never is. And so I think it creates all sorts of, crazy little thought patterns about what you have to do or what God is like or what our relationship with Him is like.
Yeah, and some people, tell me if this sounds right, if you get the sense that it can be changed and then you believe that God's all powerful and you try and pray and get Him to change it and He doesn't, what does that say about you?
Right, it's all you, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
And I have done therapy at a couple of points in my life, but did not at BYU. I did it during the short period when I was married, trying to figure out what to do about that. But I think a lot of counselors, especially at BYU in that era, so late 70s, early 80s, would have reinforced that idea. That if you're not being cured, it's because either you lack faith or you're not working hard.
And my sense is that can lead to suicidal ideation or even attempts.
Well, our mutual friend John Christofferson would be a prime example of that, right?
That he got suicidal.
He felt very suicidal and came, I think, quite close.
Yeah. So did you attempt reparative therapies per se with a psychotherapist? And then if sometimes people refer to being LGBT as an illness, like diabetes, or a sin, like gambling,
right,
or even being single. Hey, other people have to be single,
right.
Can you talk about? What's that?
They always want to compare us to the old maids,
right? Can you talk about those things? Sin, like a disease, a sin, or being single. Why are those apt comparisons? And if
right.
not, why?
I mean, what I said in the book is the comparison I like to make is the incidence of red hair and green eyes, which is slightly less frequent than being LGBTQ, or the incidence of left-handedness, which is somewhat more common than being LGBTQ, right? And to me, these are just facts of life. And, there's not a value judgment associated with having green eyes, right? It just is. And so, but, and in olden days, there was a value judgment associated with being left-handed, right? It was wrong, shameful, needed to be changed. So I think there's something sort of similar there.
But the disease comparison, do you like that?
No.
And what's inaccurate, or what do you not like about being compared to old maids? Well, it's like, hey, if there are women in the church that never get married, so if there are women or men in the church that never get married that are straight, then gay people can do it too.
Right, and I should apologize to any single woman in the church for having used that term. But it's unfortunately, I think it's coming a little less now. But that was what was always trotted out is, this wonderful woman in our ward who's never been married. The law of chastity means that she can not have sex outside of marriage. So it's exactly the same. And what I have tried to point out in the book and otherwise is, that woman can pray every morning that she'll find the person that she loves, and can choose to get married or not, and everything else, right? And yet the corollary for LGBTQ folks in the church is really to pray every day that you won't find somebody to be in love with if you're trying to remain celibate.
So there's no hope. Is that the difference?
I think the difference is that it's that there are personal decisions that can be made on one side of that coin that would keep one that allow a person to have an intimate connection with another individual and remain in good standing in the church. And on the other side, currently at least, there is not a similar choice that can be made with a same-sex partner.
So no plan, basically, that involves a family or a partner or anything.
Yeah, my experience of being married to someone of the opposite sex was not a happy one, right? So I am definitely not a person to be able to speak to how that can work for others, since it didn't work for me. But I'm happy to believe that other people do have that experience, and however they want to describe that, it's fine. It didn't work for me, and that's all I can say.
Let's talk about that for just a second. So you served a mission. Is there anything about your mission that is particularly important to say in the context of the book and your story?
One thing I would say is that I loved the experience I had. I really loved the missionaries I worked with. I loved my mission presidents. I loved the people that we taught and worked with in that sense.
Was Wayne Owens, is that right?
Yeah, Wayne and Marlene. And were such wonderful people, and still are, I'm sure, but I miss them. I think the important thing about mission is when I came home and sort of realized that I was still gay. That was this, big aha moment of, well, so much for that deal.
You felt like the mission might fix it.
I did,
and it didn't.
It clearly didn't.
And you tried. Were you super faithful as a missionary? Were you?
I'm sure I could have done better, as everyone could, but I tried. I felt like I put in a good, honest effort and tried to do the things that were asked. Looking at it from this vantage point, it's laughable, right? But then it really was how I felt, that somehow I could make this deal. That if I was going to do these things, then God would be required to act. And it's, I look at that now and think, it was a one-sided deal. God never said, sure, I'll do that for you. Again, in my view, because he feels no need to do it.
So you did marry a traditional heterosexual marriage.
Yep.
Can you talk just a bit about what's hard about that? Obviously people are going to go, oh, that's hard, but can you talk just a bit about what makes that so hard, or what made it hard for you and for your wife?
Right? Well, and that's really the point. It was harder even for her. But I think this was a person that I was really attracted to. She was a lot of fun and smart and engaging, and so somebody that I was more attracted to than I had been with other women. And I thought, okay, great, that means this will work. We'll get married in the temple, and this will all be fine. The fact that I feel no sexual attraction for her whatsoever will all be taken care of. It'll work out. It works out for everybody else. It'll work out for me. And that was not the case. That marriage was never consummated because I couldn't. And so, I think that
you couldn't. Like, was there aversion? Because was it just not interest? Like,
I mean, there were
was it short? Was it short?
attempts.
Oh, right. Well, what I'm just trying to understand, there's the attraction thing, whether or not you're attracted, but then also sometimes there's aversion where it's like, it's just not how I'm wired. And it actually, you hear about people crying, after they make attempts. So
it's the latter. It was
awful.
Awful.
Oh my gosh.
But the awful thing was really that, that despite any understanding, maybe intellectually, she felt that it was because she wasn't attractive enough. So, I felt awful about myself because I couldn't do what everybody else was doing and knew how much I'd hurt her, and she felt awful that somehow this was her fault. And the marriage lasted for about a year, so it really was a horrible time. And
some would say that's short, but it probably didn't feel short.
No, that's a lot of days.
I'm so sorry. We're laughing, but
I have to say, like, it's I feel like experience in life is the richest in life. It's how we learn, and so I'm pretty okay with the fact that I haven't done everything that I, in retrospect, would have wanted to do or could have done differently. But that experience is one that just is so hard for me to let go of, a bitter regret and recrimination.
You made the point in the book that it's not ours to tell someone they shouldn't try a mixed orientation marriage or that they can't be happy. I completely agree with you. You also said education is important, that people should kind of know what they're getting into.
Right.
One of the more controversial, and I should say, I know at least a few couples that are in mixed orientation marriages that report to me solid levels of satisfaction. So, all that said, one of the more controversial findings I found, which I didn't expect, and it was to find out that LGBT Mormons in mixed orientation marriages reported quality of life levels lower than people who have a debilitating disease like lupus.
Right.
That has been experienced as sort of offensive and controversial. I wasn't intending to offend. Can you see how people might report that sort of low level of quality of life? And if so, can you describe what could contribute to that other than sort of just the sexual element?
I mean, my experience was brief enough. I don't think I have any great insight beyond having friends who, as you said, friends who are happy in those marriages and friends who are desperately unhappy. And, I think that leads me to feel wherever everybody would ask me about it beforehand, and there aren't that many. But if you do, my view is, I think you need to know each other longer than most people do who are contemplating marriage. And I think it would be incredibly helpful to have a third party, like some kind of a counselor or therapist, guide you through exploratory conversations over a period of time.
So, what I kind of take from what you said about mixed orientation marriages is that yes, people can choose it. Yes, people can report satisfaction, but that they should probably do that with the support, with getting to know each other quite well,
right,
and probably with the support of a therapist or a counselor,
right,
to help them through it.
I think so. I think the challenges are unique and considerable from conversations that I've had with people who've had that experience over a period of time, and so anything you can do to prepare, I think, is helpful. And when I think about how I approached getting married and married in the temple, it was, some magical thinking, right? That somehow simply doing this was going to change a natural outcome that was otherwise going to happen. And so I guess just learning from my error, I would hope other people would really think about it hard and try to make sure that both of them have a realistic understanding of what the challenges will be and can go into it in a really as well prepared a way as possible.
Would you go as far as to say you would strongly caution someone to think twice before they entered into that, given your experience?
Again, my experience, I think, was so, I think I'm a Kinsey 6. There may be others who are a little more to the center of the spectrum.
So if they're bisexual, they're going to have a better shot than if they're exclusively same-sex attracted.
But I certainly think anyone should give more thought and caution and preparation than somebody where both parties purely identify as straight, right? They're not going to deal with some issues. They'll deal with plenty of other issues, but these issues that are unique to a mixed orientation marriage are the ones I think that need the extra thought preparation.
Did you see a relatively high divorce rate amongst mixed orientation marriages through your time in the church?
I would say anecdotally, because you got to say my time away from the church was pretty extensive. And in that period, I don't think I really was aware of any mixed orientation marriages. But in the kind of 10 years that I've been engaged in one form or another, a lot of people have talked to me about their heartache and challenge and difficulty. And, we've said, look, it's not a guarantee, right? I mean, there are people who are happy, there are people who are unhappy. I think my advice, and I think probably yours, would just be do everything you can ahead of time to try to make sure you're one of the happy ones.
Our study found divorce rates upwards of around 70%. Does that seem plausible to you, or totally unreasonable? Or
yeah, I don't have any independent way of knowing that.
Okay. So once that marriage ended, where did that leave you with the church and with your life?
Well, the decision to end the marriage was part of that feeling of, look, I have gone as far as I can go down this road the way I've been traveling it. And at that point, I just felt like I had done everything I could try to do to be Mormon and gay, with the gay being said quietly. And now I needed to figure out if I could be happy and gay. And, there was a whole process around that too of, I didn't, at the outset, I didn't think I fit in the gay community either. I mean, I was felt like I didn't fit as a Mormon, I didn't fit as a gay, because the only thing I knew about the gay community at that time was all stereotypes, right? And anything you got in a movie or whatever else was pretty negative. And the anecdotal conversation about it in that community was negative. And the big lesson that I learned was that after I, finally got into it and figured it out, was that I would still be me. And that was a big deal. I mean, it sounds so silly, but it was a big deal to come to that conclusion that I could be gay and still be me.
Because you had that split person, right? A little bit, trying to be the public face. But
or at least trying to not have to deal with something that I thought could be eliminated through faith or whatever else, right? And so, but what I realized was I didn't have to be what the stereotype was, right? It was kind of the lumberjack era. Maybe now I look more like a lumberjack than I didn't, but I didn't have to fit in. And another thought I had was that it was all about having sex, and I didn't necessarily want to have sex with everybody I met. And of course I came to discover that was not true, but that was a stereotype I had, and even if other people were wired differently or had different desires in that aspect than I had, I could still be me and hold on to things that I thought were important to me, and discover how to do that, which I think is very much, some of my friends who've done the faith transition, the same experience of, you don't have to throw the baby out with the bathwater. You can say, this is important to me and I want it to continue. And you discover that the stereotypes you have about this community that you've looked at from a distance probably aren't true. And you can discover a path for yourself that can be happy making and fulfilling.
So I would imagine for a Mormon boy who grew up in places like Delta, Utah,
right.
So, and you did go to California, right?
Right, after BYU.
I would imagine that could be really overwhelming or scary or exciting or intimidating. Gay culture in California in the 80s. I guess there was the AIDS scare, but just generally, it may have been shocking to you. How do you find your way dating and figuring out what your morals are? You kind of just talked about it, but maybe go,
Yeah, the interesting thing about it for me was that I discovered affirmation right after I came out, and
in LA, right?
in LA, and it was in that mid '80s period. It was very active and a really vibrant group, and that became my lifeline because I talk about the feeling of it as being bilingual, right? There were people who spoke gay and people who spoke Mormon, and I could, learn in a setting where I could translate with other people who understood what the translation was. And that was hugely helpful to me. And that was my first dating pool, with people who'd had similar experiences and everything. And it was, so I have great affection for affirmation in that era of my life because it really helped me to figure out how to plot a course that would be congruent with my values and the things that were important to me, and also to then open myself up to a broader experience.
So that was helpful. You eventually became a board member of Affirmation for at least a time, right?
Yep, a couple years.
Did you run into, gay post-Mormons where their life was pretty traumatized by their experiences in the church?
Yeah, and I would say in the crowd that I was with in the 80s was a little less so. It was, I think, certainly people my age that I was meeting there were just like, okay, I couldn't figure out how to make this apply to my life or figure out how to bring the two together. So I'm not bitter, but I'm also not involved. I just kind of moved on and figured out what's going on. I think the bitterness came, at least from my experience with folks, I think the really bitter things came a little later. But maybe it also had to do with if you'd done reparative therapy at BYU, the bitterness probably came instantly for those folks.
You mentioned Carolyn Pearson as an important influence on you.
Right.
When I interviewed her for Mormon Stories, she made the quote, and I remember this. She said, "We throw them into the gutter and expect them not to get dirty."
Yeah.
What do you think she meant by that as it relates to, let's just say, the LGBT Mormon experience in the 80s?
Right.
Was it relevant? Is that quote relevant?
Well, I think certainly it is for some number of people where families literally said, okay, if you're not going to do the church thing, then we have no desire to stay connected. And I would love to think that was a minority. I think it was, but every one is a catastrophe and a heartache, right? And one is too many. But I certainly knew people whose families were estranged because they had come out, and especially living in LA, it was like they might have grown up in Utah or Idaho or Arizona, and part of being in LA was to have some distance from their families because there was so much trauma and pain and hurt there.
Yeah. So, tell us about how you ended up meeting the man that would become your partner.
Yeah. So I met a guy in LA, and we had a relationship about 5 years.
So you were kind of a one man, long-term kind of guy. Is that fair to say or not?
Pretty fair to say. And then we moved to New York together from LA, and then broke up, and my career continued. I was in Europe for a couple of years with the firm I was working with, and then joined a different firm in San Francisco. And that was where I met my partner of 19 years.
It's hard to not say his name. So talk about really quickly why we don't use his name.
Right.
And is that his wish or yours?
I have really felt that I wanted to honor his privacy, that this is my story, telling in my experience and my perception in my way, and that if he ever wants to tell it, then he should be able to tell his own story. So I just felt like I wanted to allow him to have as much distance as he wants to have, and if he ever wants to engage, he will.
Did he ever ask you not to use his name, or when you talk about it? Or?
No,
okay.
it's
just what you prefer.
Yeah.
Okay. So you were together 19 years.
Mm-hmm.
Can you talk about what your relationship was like, to the extent that you're comfortable?
Sure. Happy.
Okay.
We had ups and downs, I think, as everyone does, but on the whole, it was a very happy experience. I'm hugely grateful to have had that learning in my life of how to be with somebody and at least try to love someone more than you love yourself, and to take care of someone, to think of them first, and all those lessons that you learn in a relationship like that.
One of my early faux pas as I tried to become more educated about the LGBT experience was even mentioning the phrase the gay lifestyle. And I once had a coworker who I didn't know was gay, who I said some awfully offensive things to, describe to me what the gay lifestyle was for him and his partner.
Yeah.
And he's like, we wake up, we have breakfast, we go to work, we work all day, we come home, we eat, we do the dishes, maybe watch some TV, and we go to bed.
Right.
Can you describe what your lifestyle was with your partner?
My partner was a hospital administrator. He was the executive director of the East Bay AIDS Center in Berkeley at Alta Bates Hospital. Was a board member at the time of the Harm Reduction Coalition, which was around intravenous drug users and also sex. So it was a drug exchange, needle exchange program and condom distribution program. So and it was
that's inspiring work.
He's such a wonderful person, and and really was drawn to that sort of thing of how to be helpful to people. And then after we'd been together about a year, he really felt like in that EBAC, East Bay AIDS Center experience, he wanted to be able to be more impactful than running the program. He really wanted to be able to be a doctor and to help individuals in that way. So even though he had a master's in public health, he decided he wanted to go back and do post-grad pre-med. And we were talking about that, and I'd looked at where there were med schools in San Francisco and New York, because I was being recruited to join a firm in New York. And there were 2 med schools within 2 hours of us in San Francisco and 12 within 2 hours of New York. And it was like, okay, the job works for me, and it also, I think, coincidentally would probably make it more likely that he could achieve his dream. So I went to Columbia, did the 2-year program there, postgrad pre-med, and then a year of taking the MCATs and applying. And it was a really nerve-wracking time as to whether that would happen. He'd be able to have the opportunity to achieve that dream. But he was accepted, and then at age 42, started med school.
Where?
In Albany.
Albany. And did you put him through med school?
Well, no, I think we did that together. But what we would do is, yes, we had an apartment in Albany that he would stay at during the week, and then we'd be home in Westchester County in New York on the weekends. And that first semester was, I think, the hardest thing we ever did together, because I had kind of reached a point in my career where I had a little more freedom and flexibility and was ready to enjoy it. Right at the same moment that he was trying to dig into school with kids who had been in it. They're 20 years his junior and were continuing, what they'd been doing, and so he had to learn how to learn all over again, and it was so incredibly stressful for him. And my thought had been, well, at least when you're here on the weekend, we can enjoy life. Mm-hmm. It was like, no, he needed to study. It felt like every moment, and felt such pressure because he just felt like he wasn't catching on fast enough, or it was so hard. And what we kind of learned in the second semester of that was that if I was not traveling on business and didn't have clients in New York on a Friday of a week, then I would take the train up to Albany on Thursday. We could have a late dinner together. I'd work from his apartment on Friday, then we could drive home. And that 2-hour drive home was really our most time for connection, and it kind of saved us. But it's, I think about that as just such an object lesson of, if you're willing to work hard enough and really suffer, that you probably can make even the most unlikely dreams come true. But he worked like a dog, and the first 2 years of med school are the kind of classroom years, and the second 2 are the clinical years where you're practicing in the hospital setting. And the first 2 years, he was at a significant disadvantage with the other people he was going to school with, and the second 2 years he was the star, because he'd worked in hospitals and knew how to relate and do all those things. So the second 2 years were a lot easier than the first 2. But.
What an incredible story of you guys working together and working through hard stuff. Was it a traditional marriage or relationship in many ways?
Well,
would a heterosexual couple go, that's kind of our life, it's just 2 guys?
Yeah.
That's what I mean.
Yeah, I think so.
I remember a friend of mine saying, but for the gay thing, you're right smack on the center point of
That's what I
of
meant.
normal.
That's what I meant.
And so I think so.
Did you consider adopting at all?
We did. Our thought had been that if he didn't get accepted to med school, then we would adopt and he'd be the stay-at-home parent. We just felt like, my job was kind of so demanding and my travel schedule was pretty intense that it was neither possible nor would make sense for me to be the stay-at-home parent, although I would have loved to. I would have been a very indulgent father, but and my partner was much better able to be a more disciplined one. But the thought was that we would do that, and then when it was accepted, that kind of ended that idea.
Name 3 things you loved most to do together, and then we'll move on.
Okay. One of the things that I've always thought about him is that he was the best version of himself at home. And I think for most of us, we're probably on our best behavior when we're outside, in work or social settings or whatever it might be. But he was the best version of himself when we were together. And my favorite thing was to have time with just the two of us. And we had a pretty active social life. We did a lot of traveling, but as long as we were together, that was the happiest time of my life.
Wow.
Is that 3 things? That's 2.
That's good. I'll take it. I'll take it.
I think, and the other thing I would just say is that he had a really dry sense of humor, and a lot of people, as they first came to know him, wouldn't really get his humor, and I loved it. I'd love to laugh with him.
So how many years into your relationship with him did the church start entering back in?
12.
12 years in, what happened? So this is around 2007. 2007. Okay.
So, this was not exactly what he'd bargained for. Interestingly, his stepmother is Mormon, and he has a half-sister who went on a mission and, married in the temple and has lots of kids and, really neat lady who's an author, interestingly enough. So it wasn't unfamiliar to him that someone was gay, that was Mormon, and he knew my family, and so obviously got that there. But it just wasn't, in the early years of our relationship especially, just wasn't anything that I was particularly engaged with, other than to be very respectful of what mattered to my family, as I wanted them to be respectful of what mattered to me. But over time I came to really want to have more of a spiritual component in my life, and we had gone to a number of different churches over time, and none of them really spoke to me. It just didn't. There are lots of great things about all of them, and especially that all of them we went to were very accepting of gay members and parishioners and congregants, and so that made for an easy way to engage in a congregation, but it just didn't work for me.
I don't love to interrupt, but I forgot to mention that you requested excommunication back after your marriage failed.
I did forget to say that.
No, I forgot to ask you about it. So
yeah.
Maybe you should just talk about that briefly so people understand your church status
right
prior to re-engaging. So I'm sorry.
I'm glad you did, because that's a pretty critical point. At the time that the marriage was ending and was being annulled, I felt like the only way I could feel like I had integrity in my process of figuring out where to go from here was to ask to be excommunicated.
Still as a believer, correct?
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was. Yeah, and it was interesting in that I had waffled back and forth about whether I would actually attend the court, and in the end I did. I'm glad I did, because it was a positive experience. But in that court they asked me to what was my relationship with Jesus Christ, and I had an opportunity to talk about that, and I was grateful to be able to say that I felt as close to him at that point as I ever had, and that I had felt like I'd had experiences relating to the Book of Mormon, so that was still something that mattered to me. But that, as I said, I think my dad had been on probably 3 different high councils at that point, and I wondered if he had sat through any council sessions like this, and whether any of their kids would. That this is something that I felt like we probably needed to figure out better as a church, and that was my goal, was to go figure out for myself what I needed to do, and I was going to not be living a life in keeping with church council at that point. President Kimball was the president of the church, and if you remember or know, in his early years as president of the church, it was almost like church courts were a factory. He had this feeling that that there was a necessary disciplinary process for repentance, and so there was when I asked to be excommunicated, all I had to say was that I was gay. And I don't recall anyone asking if I'd had sex with anyone, but I hadn't, and that was all was needed, was just, if you say you're gay, well then okay, bye. And so that was, I think, a couple things I take out of that experience for myself. One is I wanted it in order to feel myself that I was not pretending to be Mormon when I wasn't Mormon. I don't know that anybody else needs to do exactly the same thing, but that was how I thought about it, and so that's what I did. But I think because it was my initiative and my desire, it wasn't a hard outcome or something that I felt really bitter about, because I'd asked them to do it and they did it.
Interestingly, in one of the other research papers we had, we measured quality of life by relationship to the church, and oddly, the LGBT Mormons that had been excommunicated reported the highest quality of life. I didn't expect that. Right. Do you have a theory? I mean, I guess it can be an empowering move. Maybe right. It severs any cognitive dissonance. Any theories on why excommunicated LGBT Mormons reported the highest quality of life?
Well, I think it is. I think it does eliminate some dissonance, or can. But I also found that when I went back to church, and we'll get there in a minute, but as a non-member of the church, I felt great freedom in being able to participate any way I wanted to.
I love that part of the book.
Right.
We'll get there. But
I said I got to choose my own home teaching route. Right. I could do whatever I could engage any way. And like, what were they going to do? Excommunicate me?
And you're living authentically. You're not living a lie.
Right.
Still, really quick, as someone who's been excommunicated, it's really hard to imagine that being a positive experience.
Yeah.
But you're saying it was.
But the difference is I initiated it, and I hope that wasn't.
No. It's your experience. No, I'm just saying I wanted to understand it. That's all. But it's because you initiated it, then they were just lovely to you, or?
Well, I don't think I would love to imagine that somebody sitting there took to heart the conversation, but I think in that era it just reinforced what they already believed, which was that if you were going to be gay, of course you couldn't be connected to the church. You wouldn't want to be, right? Because you were going to go live this evil lifestyle, right?
So it wasn't that they treated you in necessarily a lovely way.
They were respectful, but it wasn't much more than that.
But for you, it wasn't an awful traumatic experience.
No.
It was what? Liberating?
Yeah, because it was, they did what I asked them to do.
And then the other thing that's just really blows my mind is the idea that wouldn't cause for you a faith crisis where you're just like, this church is messed up, it's defective, they've treated me terribly, I'm done forever. How did you avoid that?
I think, I really think it was because I felt like I had a personal relationship with Christ. And so that, to me, was independent of the church. And I was still happy to believe that it was the Church of Jesus Christ, but I also felt like I could continue to live my life and try to and maintain that connection as best I could. And because he understood the circumstances of my life and the desires of my heart and everything around it, that I was okay with him.
And it seems like you were able to hold on to your relationship with Christ by not continuing to try and change yourself through him.
Right.
Was that an important piece?
It is. And I think I figured that out during the course of that year of marriage, that that the reason this wasn't going to change was because it wasn't because I was evil and not doing what God wanted me to do. It was because God wasn't going to make the change, and therefore to me it was because he didn't need to.
Over 40% of the respondents in our study reported some spiritual experience from God affirming their LGBT identity.
Right. And I think I had one very similar to many of those people, which is I had that experience of being known and being loved, being known completely in every aspect of myself, and being loved.
That's wonderful.
I agree.
Not everybody gets that.
I feel fortunate in many ways in my life.
And that happened around this time or earlier? Or?
Yeah, it was during that year of being married, and it was interesting because it was such a horrible time in so many ways, but it was also, and it was I did some counseling at that time to just try to figure out what I could do, and I think that it was really helpful in being able to say, I can think about things differently. I can imagine being happy in a different way than I thought it was going to be. And it's one of the things that I've tried to say in the book and in conversations around it is, I was a pretty miserable Mormon pretending not to be gay. I was a really happy gay person not being Mormon. And now I feel like I'm a happy gay person who is Mormon.